Your polling numbers are pretty bad right now. You were like the guy, right?
Yep. How much worse would it have been?
You know, how would you respond to that? It's not been anywhere near enough.
Climate change, inclusive economic growth, and it did.
Money, but why now?
How does Trudeau answer questions about his popularity drop? What does his word choice reveal about his strategy for this interview? When politicians defend themselves, they'll often give minimal admissions, meaning that they'll agree with the interviewer on smaller points, to emphasize that they take the interviewers and the people's concerns seriously, allegedly. However, the main concern of politicians will always be self-branding. That's the pattern we see in this interview as well. What do you think about the interview? Let us know in the comments. If you liked the video, click the like button and subscribe for more videos. Welcome aboard. In political interviews, it's the interviewer's job to act as a substitute for the viewer, which means asking the tough questions that viewers would like to know the answers to. According to the scholars Clayman and Heritage, the interviewer's questions often embody assumptions that reject the interviewee's stated positions. The interviewer's aim is not just to obtain and impart information, but more importantly, to ask the politician to account for his words and actions. The politician, on the other hand, doesn't want to be seen as tough first and foremost. First and foremost, the politician has an interest in coming across as relaxed and relatable and having a nice guy attitude. He's interested in being on good terms with the interviewer because he knows that the interviewer represents the viewer. Right off the bat, we notice Trudeau's nice guy attitude.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast. It's great to have you.
It's great to be here, but I know people are more excited about you coming back from mat leave than they are about me being on.
I'm sure that is not the case, but thank you very much.
Now that we got this humility exchange, real or not, out of the way, the questioning can begin. And in this interview, unlike the CNN interview I analyzed, Trudeau actually gets some tough questions. To understand Trudeau's tactics, we need to understand the 4 pillars of political advertising. The first pillar is the politician giving positive personal details to show that he's sympathetic and trustworthy, supposedly. The second pillar is the politician presenting his policies, preferably being as general, even vague as possible, so that as many people as possible will agree with him. That's why politicians frequently use slogans like hope, justice, and change that don't mean anything. Unfortunately though, many people only remember the positive emotions they felt when they heard the positive word, and politicians bank on that. The third pillar is the politician attacking his opponent rhetorically. This creates a contrast which obviously makes the politician look good, in theory that is. The fourth and final pillar is the politician showing that he's in sync with the values and wishes of ordinary people. This pillar is closely connected to the second pillar.
Your polling numbers are pretty bad right now. They're as bad as they've ever been for your government since you took power in 2015. But the group that I really want to talk to you about today is a group that are big listeners of our show, Gen Z millennials, and you are polling particularly bad with this group. And I wonder if you reflect on it, why you think this group is leaving you in very big numbers, because they came out to vote for you in 2015, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting to note that Trudeau seems to be reacting to the only encouraging statement in the interviewer's long opening, thus underlining this one and only statement that portrays him in a positive light. This is a recurring pattern, Trudeau constantly trying to emphasize the positive rather than the negative. The negative things he agrees with, not because he wants to, but because he has to, are a stepping stone to get to the positive, alleged positive. However, she also shows what could be understood as compassion, or at least goodwill, because when she sees that Trudeau is scratching his ear, she changes her tone to sound comforting.
Is leaving you in very big numbers, because they came out to vote for you in 2015, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Trudeau was asked why this particular group is leaving him. He goes on to make a roundabout answer. Roundabout answers are designed to get around to the answer eventually. So, unsurprisingly, politicians prefer this answer type, as it allows them to either modify the question completely or emphasize and answer the most convenient parts of the question. No matter what, roundabout answers buy the politician more time to think about his wording, which is important, because the wording determines his image, how people will perceive him.
And we worked with them 8 years ago to reverse a government that didn't do anything on climate change, that didn't believe in inclusive economic growth, kept with trickle down, give tax breaks to the wealthiest. We managed to turn that around significantly.
Worked with them, he says. This way, when he continues with the pronoun we, the voters who are leaving him are contained in this community. Linguistically then, Trudeau doesn't only refer to his own cabinet. He's making the voters the protagonists in his narrative, so that the Conservative government isn't only his enemy, but their enemy too. Looking at his speeches and interviews, Trudeau's skilled at rhetorically constituting a collective identity that the audience can identify themselves with.
This is a moment of uncertainty like none of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. We must remember who we are. The world is changing fast, but our top priority will always remain building a better today and tomorrow for you and for your kids. This is the foundation of everything we do.
It's interesting to note the different intentions at play here. The interviewer wants to know why young people are leaving him. That's her focus. Trudeau's primary focus, as evidenced by his first response to the question, is to make sure that people know that no matter how bad they think he is, his opponent is worse, allegedly.
And then the past few years have been really, really hard, particularly on young people, where there is now a sense not just of the challenges of paying for groceries or paying for rent or anything, but the idea of home ownership, the idea of a really strong, exciting future seems further and further away now than it did just a few years ago. And that loss of hope and optimism is devastating for people's morale. Of course, they're gonna grumble at government and they're gonna say that the world's going in the wrong direction, and we have to step up and make sure we're solving for that.
Of course, he says, making the popularity drop sound like a natural result. He also says grumble at government as opposed to grumble at us as something specific and personal. The implication being that this setback could happen to any government.
But do you think you could have or should have done more for them?
I think I can continue to do more for them.
A simple and basic principle when watching political interviews is to ask, what was the question? Because oftentimes politicians will modify the question to such a degree that they end up answering a different question or a slightly different question. It's about noticing the subtle changes they make. Here, the interviewer says could have and should have, referring to the past. Trudeau, on the other hand, uses the presupposition continue, referring to the future, which is very different. On a surface level, it sounds like he's responding the way he should. The reason for that is because he reuses her words, do more for them.
I've done more for them.
Do more for them.
As stated by Claimant and Heritage, politicians use repetition to make it sound like they're properly responsive to the issues that the question raises, when that's not actually the case. Trudeau should have been interrupted here. Instead, he's allowed to continue answering this now modified question. He goes on to blame all the presumed external factors that have led to this lack of optimism, meant to underline that much of what's happened is out of his control, apparently.
I think one of the things that is real is whether it's coming out of the pandemic that was such a kick in the teeth to everyone, whether it's the war in Ukraine that's affecting food prices and energy prices, whether it's the global economic slowdown that's driving up interest rates and driving up inflation. These are things that really, really have tangible impacts, not just on people's daily lives, but on how they see the future. So yes, a government is always going to wear what's going on.
Once again, Trudeau turns the attention away from his specific policies, the policies that might have led to his popularity drop and that the interviewer wants to talk about. A government is always going to wear what's going on, he says in a downplaying fashion, normalizing the challenges he's facing. This normalization is done for self-protective and thus self-serving reasons.
The question that people have to ask is, how do we solve it? How do we see an optimistic vision of the future once again? And that's where I am confident that the work that we're doing and the positive solutions to really complex problems that we've been putting forward and are going to be putting forward over the coming years is going to allow particularly young people to see themselves in a positive future once again.
He uses this slight but important diversion from the question to predictably continue his optimism discourse and guide people how to think.
To see themselves in a positive future once again.
In this passage, there's a special emphasis on the second pillar of political advertising, because he doesn't give specifics. So when he says he's confident, he doesn't say what he's confident about. And by the way, it's not very surprising that he's confident. I mean, would he have said if he wasn't confident?
I remember back in 2015 when you appointed yourself youth minister. Remember, like you were like the guy, right?
Yep.
The benchmark housing prices have gone up 70% in this country. The average rent is now north of $2,000 a month. It's going up like $100 a month. And how would you respond to the criticism that your government, in the 8 years that it's been in power, has done very little to bring more homes to market in this country?
How do politicians deal with criticism? They keep finding new self-protective tactics.
I guess the question I'd ask is, how much worse would it have been if we hadn't put forward a national housing strategy in 2017 with $70 billion worth of investment that allowed for 2 million families to get into new homes, after 10 years of a Conservative government that did nothing on housing? I mean, everyone understands housing takes a long lead time to actually make a difference. And if we hadn't got the federal government back into the business of housing, then everything would be much worse right now.
He says, I guess, which is a hedge he uses to sound momentarily uncertain, even though it's very much expected that this would be his guess, because as politicians learn from day one, the best defense is offense. In this case, yet another rhetorical attack on the antagonist in his narrative.
How much worse would it have been?
He answers the question with another question, a common tactic when a speaker seeks to avoid the direct answer and go straight to the sales pitch, as Trudeau does here. He continues the normalization discourse with the presupposition that everyone allegedly understands that it takes a lot of time.
I mean, everyone understands housing takes a long lead time.
This way, he keeps associating with other people to make it look like he's not alone in thinking and saying this. But how much time? Politicians are never specific about that, unless when they're campaigning, of course. Saying long time is a way for politicians to grant themselves leeway. He says it could have been worse. What he conveniently leaves out is the obvious counter-argument that just because things could have been worse, it doesn't mean things are good.
So we actually kept things, on a slightly better track than they are. But there is so much more to do, and that's exactly what we're doing.
This is an example of a minimal admission. Politicians will frequently admit to smaller things when they know that there are bigger things they've done wrong or that they'll be confronted with. Politicians will frequently admit that there's much more to be done without saying what needs to be done specifically. So much so that there's an academic term for it, intentional vagueness. The reason why they aren't specific is because making these small admissions is part of the strategy. Giving spontaneous, heartfelt answers with specific goals and plans isn't. Minimal admissions are designed to get the interviewer to stop asking skeptical questions about the same topic. Fortunately for the viewers, though, it doesn't always work.
You mentioned the national housing strategy. When you talk to experts about it, they feel like it has resulted in not nearly enough homes. It's been inefficient and slow. How would you respond to that? That it's not been anywhere near enough?
First of all, that's a good question. Secondly, a question comes with the so-called complex preface. The purpose of a complex preface is to force a nuanced and unrehearsed answer out of the politician, and she uses this preface to introduce a so-called fork. A fork underlines an alleged discrepancy between the politician and facts and statistics, in this case, what experts say.
I will say it hasn't been enough, and that's why we're doing much more.
What hasn't been enough? Specifically, he doesn't tell us because it isn't part of the strategy. It isn't one of the 4 pillars of political advertising. What is part of the strategy, however, is to turn every negative into a positive. She says hasn't been enough, referring to the past, but he quickly changes the verb to doing, referring to the present and future, because he isn't interrupted as he should have been. He takes the opportunity to appeal to emotion and pity, pathos. In the following, notice how he's merely referencing old news and doesn't give specifics. He knows that as long as he's speaking, he won't be asked uncomfortable questions. So this is stalling, like some or most exam situations, by the way. Interviewers should constantly be aware of this and not hesitate to interrupt. Otherwise, experienced politicians like Trudeau will take control. A political interview is a battle, and with his statements, Trudeau shows that he's very much aware of that.
The one that really breaks my heart is the people who say, okay, 5 years ago we started saving up for a down payment. We knew we'd be able to put a down payment. And now we find ourselves further away than we were 5 years ago because housing prices are growing so much faster and availability is dropping at a time where we were supposed to be getting into the market now. And that's heartbreaking. And that is something that we absolutely are stepping up to turn around. Now, the thing with housing is you can't fix it overnight. I mean, there are things that we are doing that are taking the pressure off right now, but...
And then he's allowed to continue his monologue for another minute and 30 seconds, which is much too long in a political interview, no matter who's being interviewed. This monologue time feeds into the politician's agenda, as the politician has an interest in being as long-winded as possible. It's like an on-off button, off while he's looking for a way to win this one.
The thing with housing is...
and on when he's found the monologue he wants to use.
You can't fix it overnight. I mean, there are...
Here, we also notice another common tactic, which I call oversimplification in order to give leeway. What this means is that the politician makes a ridiculously obvious statement to take some of the pressure and thus responsibility off of him. Trudeau says,
you can't fix it overnight.
Everyone knows that it's not going to happen overnight. That's not the question. The question is that he's already had years to do it. That's different. Overall, I think the interviewer does an okay job. However, there needs to be more interruptions. Interviews are dialogues, not monologues. So, for contrast, let's watch a few seconds of a political interview on Danish television with a politician who keeps avoiding direct answers and a host who doesn't mind interrupting, to say the least.
Det var forkert. Den vurdering var forkert, for nu strammer I igen.
Jamen, altså, det er jo sådan...
Var den vurdering forkert, Mette Frederiksen?
Det er jo sådan...
Var den vurdering forkert?
De udtalelser, jeg kommer med som justitsminister, har jeg ansvaret for,
så tog du fejl, da du sagde... Nej, men det gør du ikke, Mette Frederiksen. Så strammer
jo,
så må du... Okay, så du tog fejl. Du sagde dengang, der var strammet så meget, som det var muligt.
Jeg står fuldstændig...
Lad os lige få fastholde sammenhængen, fordi det vi har set er, at vi har set generelt dansk politik...
This interview style, which might seem too aggressive at first, is one that confuses politicians because it interferes with the rehearsed catchphrases and monologues that are standard parts of their media training. This particular interview is one of the best I've seen. For contrast, again, notice how Trudeau gets away with repeating intentions.
My vision of success for what looks like in the coming years is for people to see that over the coming 2 or 3 years, more housing starts are coming up, more apartment builds, more purpose-built rentals, better construction and interest rates coming down so people can see themselves in that.
At this point, Trudeau appears to have turned an interview that should be about specifics into a monologue about visions.
My vision of success.
A word that's part of his optimism discourse and that he therefore has to repeat a lot.
But that's something that we are so focused on solving.
But because it would be too specific to say how they're solving it, and just as important, how long it will take, aside from the years they've already had, he has to refer to other entities to avoid the sole responsibility for the criticism he's facing.
With an understanding that there's not a single simplistic solution. These are all things that have to come together. All partners from provinces to municipalities to nonprofit to private sector all have to be part of it. And that's the kind of complexity that we're grappling with right now and we're solving.
Now, solving it doesn't sound so optimistic and positive after all. It sounds like the solutions are very far away.
Canada's immigration numbers have increased significantly. Those immigration numbers could cause the housing shortfall to increase by 500,000 units in 2 years. And so why wasn't there a plan to ensure that this influx of people matched our housing needs better?
All WH questions are called presupposition questions because they presuppose that the interviewee has an answer, unlike yes-no questions or dichotomy questions as they're also called. In that sense, she's presupposing that there wasn't any plan. On a surface level, this sounds like a critical question, which is good. However, the question is still too open. It's much too easy for Trudeau to say that there was a plan and elaborate on that with another sales pitch. A better way would have been to ask him to describe the plan, very short and specifically, and then ask why it didn't work. And if he didn't answer specifically, keep repeating the question, like Musk did when he decided to be the interviewer.
Do you think you prioritize freedom of speech over misinformation and hate speech?
Do you see a rise in hate speech?
I mean,
but just a personal anecdote, like what do you? I don't. You see more hate speech personally?
I would say I would see more hateful content in that.
Content you don't like or hateful? What do you mean to describe a hateful thing? Can you name one example?
I honestly don't. You
can't name a single example.
Like, why no plan?
Oh, that is part of what we've been doing as a plan to make sure that we're responding to shortages in the construction industry, that we're bringing in the right kinds of skilled trades as well. That is also something that has been shifting over the coming years. These are not things that can turn on a dime, unfortunately. Government moves extremely slowly in responding to things, but it is moving because you don't want a government lurching around everywhere and flipping back and forth. You want a plan that's going to steadily make things better in tangible ways over the coming year, over the coming years, over the coming decade. And that's where understanding and bringing in all the different factors from global shortages to supply chains to inflation and interest rates to purchasing power. These are the kinds of things that come into building a plan like that, including around immigration numbers.
Trudeau ends with repetition of the topic that the interviewer introduced.
Including around immigration numbers.
Canada's immigration numbers have...
Again, repetitions make it sound like the politician's been properly responsive to the issues that the interviewer's question raised, even though that's not necessarily the case. Because what was the answer Trudeau actually gave? It was a counterclaim consisting of the same generic policies as prescribed by the second pillar of political advertising, with its rather convenient references to time, steadily, over the coming years, which he upgrades to over the coming decade. He grants himself leeway to not have to show results right here and now.
That's going to steadily make over the coming year, over the coming years, over the coming decade.
By doing this, he's also making his leadership sound consistent and firm. So it's a double win. Rhetorically speaking, that is, because strategies don't guarantee that viewers will believe them. We see another example of the oversimplification in order to give leeway tactic.
These are not things that can turn on a dime, unfortunately.
Again, everyone knows that these things aren't going to turn on a dime, so the only reason for phrasing it like this is to take some of the pressure off of him. Lastly, his use of the pronoun you is relevant to note.
You don't want a government lurching around everywhere and flipping back and forth. You want a plan that's going to steadily make things better.
This is Trudeau guiding the audience what to think and want, while attributing positive characteristics to himself and his government in the process.
Why just do that now? You know, people have been saying that for years, right? To tie the money to municipalities, maybe getting rid of exclusionary zoning. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing all these letters from Minister Sean Fraser's office coming out telling Calgary to get rid of exclusionary zoning if they want money. But why now?
Well, quite frankly, because the need is there. I mean, even in Calgary that finally did it, it was a very contested discussion. There is... I'd love to be able to wave a federal magic wand and make it happen. That's not the way this country works. And that's where steady engagement, bringing along partners, including provincial partners that often are more conservative and not really into spending and investing in communities, getting them to the right place has been a lot of work, but that's what we're continuing to do.
It's the same quite predictable pattern we're seeing, attacking his opponent rhetorically whenever possible as a way to shift focus and shift blame. This is all part of the self-branding.
Provincial partners that often are more conservative and not really into spending and investing in communities.
We observe yet another example of the oversimplification in order to give leeway tactic.
I'd love to be able to wave a federal magic wand and make it happen.
Here he's talking about waving a federal magic wand, as if anyone thinks that that's how a country works. What it is, though, is another way for him to emphasize and exaggerate his recurring message, that supposedly he can't be held personally accountable for the actions of other influential people, in this case conservative politicians. which again lives up to the third pillar of political advertising, rhetorical attacks on the opponent. There's a lot more to say about this interview, but this will have to do for now. Like and subscribe for more videos. See you next time.